December 26, 1944. The hilltop village of Sommocolonia, Italy, had become a killing ground. Under cover of Christmas night, German and Italian fascist troops had infiltrated in civilian clothes. By dawn, a full-scale assault, Operation Wintergewitter, was sweeping through the Serchio Valley. The outnumbered American defenders of the 92nd Infantry Division were being pushed back. But one man refused to retreat. First Lieutenant JohnRFox, a forward observer from the 598th Field Artillery Battalion, remained in a second-floor room of a stone house. From his radio, he directed American artillery fire onto the swarming enemy, adjusting the barrage closer and closer. His commander on the other end of the line, a close friend named Otis Zachary, grew alarmed. "Fox, that will be on you," he protested. Fox's response, calm and absolute, is etched into the record of the Medal of Honor. "Fire it. There's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell." The shells fell. The house erupted. Fox was killed instantly. When American forces retook the village days later, they found his body in the rubble, and surrounding it, the bodies of approximately 100 German soldiers. His sacrifice had not been in vain. It stalled the enemy advance, bought precious time, and allowed his comrades to regroup and counterattack. This was not a moment of suicidal despair. It was a calculated, savage act of war. Fox understood the arithmetic. One life, properly spent, could tip the balance. But who was this man, and how did a soldier from a segregated, often despised unit come to perform one of the most extraordinary acts of sacrifice in American military history? By December 1944, the Allied advance up the Italian boot had ground to a bloody halt. Before them loomed the Gothic line, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's masterwork of defensive engineering, a belt of steel-reinforced concrete, interlocking machine gun nests, and artillery zeroed on every mountain pass. For months, Kesselring had bled the Allied armies white, trading terrain for time and German lives for Allied casualties. The front had stabilized, frozen into the mountains as winter closed in. But Kesselring was not content to merely defend. In the Serchio Valley sector, a rugged, fog-shrouded corridor held by the American 92nd Infantry Division, he saw an opportunity. German intelligence had assessed the 92nd as the weakest link in the Allied line, an inexperienced and troubled unit of African-American soldiers led by white officers, starved of trust and combat seasoning. Here, the Germans believed, a sharp, sudden blow might rupture the entire front. Thus was born Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm. On December 26, 1944, a mixed Axis force of 3 German battalions and 4 battalions of the Italian 4th Alpine Division, Monterosa, 20,000 men trained in the Alps and indoctrinated in Mussolini's fading dream, slammed into the American positions. The attack was meticulously planned, a Christmas night infiltration by soldiers in civilian clothes, followed by a dawn assault by uniformed formations. The primary objective was not territorial conquest, but to shatter the 92nd, relieve pressure on Italian units, and buy the Reich a few more months of life. This was not merely a battle between Americans and Germans. It was also a civil war between Italians. The Monterosa Division, fighting for Mussolini's fascist rump state, faced Italian partisans in the hills and eventually Brazilian and American troops in the valleys. The Battle of the Garfanana was a microcosm of Italy's own brutal, fratricidal conflict. As German and Italian troops advanced into Sommocolonia on Christmas night, they expected to sweep aside a demoralized, second-line American division. They did not know that among the few defenders remaining in the village was a forward observer from Massachusetts, a man who had already decided the price of his position. The 92nd Infantry Division carried 2 burdens into battle, one of steel and one of skin. Nicknamed the BuffaloSoldiers, a proud revival of the black cavalry regiments that had tamed the American West, it was the only African-American infantry division to see combat in Europe. But in the segregated army of 1944, only meant something else entirely. The vast majority of black soldiers never touched a rifle. They loaded ships, drove trucks, and dug graves, consigned by official policy to service units because the government believed black men lacked aggressiveness for combat. The 92nd was the exception, but even its existence came with chains. Its senior officers were white, its equipment was often secondhand, and its every action was scrutinized through a lens of racial skepticism. When the division fought well, it was ignored. When it faltered, The failures were weaponized against the entire race. This was the double war. As veteran James Dougherty, drafted from a segregated Washington, D.C., wrote, "How dare they draft me? I was fighting for two evils, the Nazis in Germany and my own country that was doing the same kind of things." Every battle was simultaneously a fight against the Wehrmacht and a fight for the right to be recognized as an equal. Every man in the 92nd knew that their performance would be used to judge all black Americans. Forward observers like Lieutenant JohnRFox occupied the most exposed edge of this double war. Operating miles ahead of the main line, isolated in stone villages and frozen foxholes, they were the eyes of the artillery, and the first to die when the enemy broke through. Fox had volunteered for this Christmas assignment. He was an engineering graduate of Wilberforce University, one of the few colleges that allowed black students to earn an ROTC commission. He was a husband and a father. He was also a man who, in his widow's words, felt that we were as good as anybody else, and he was going to prove it. Before the heroism, there was the craft. First Lieutenant JohnRFox was a forward observer, a profession demanding the cold precision of an engineer and the cold nerve of a sniper. His tools were not rifles or grenades, but a map board, a protractor, binoculars, a compass, and the SCR 610 radio strapped to his back. His language was a coded shorthand of numbers and pro words, drilled into him at the Field Artillery School. Observer identification, warning order, target location, target description, method of engagement, method of fire and control. His mission was to stand alone, ahead of the friendly lines, and become the finger on the trigger of the king of battle. The forward observer was the most vulnerable man on the battlefield. He operated in isolation, often miles from the nearest rifle squad. He was a priority target for enemy snipers and counter-battery radar. To call fire on one's own position was the final, desperate act of a man who knew he was about to be overrun, a contingency practiced in theory, but rarely executed in fact. The doctrinal term was danger close. Friendly troops within 600 meters of impact. Fox would soon request fire 60 yards away. Fox had run the mental drill. He knew the math, the time of flight of the 105mm shells, the dispersion pattern, the lethal radius. He knew exactly what he was doing when he keyed the handset. When his first adjustment landed perfectly, he told his battalion commander, "That was just where I wanted it. Bring it in 60 yards. The commander protested. The barrage was already dangerously close. Fox insisted. He cut the distance in half. As German troops surrounded his second-floor position, the commander's voice crackled through the receiver with one final warning. "Fox, that will be on you." Fox's reply is preserved in the granite language of the Medal of Honor citation. It was not a scream of despair nor a prayer. It was an order, calm, absolute, and professional. "Fire it, there's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell." The shells fell. The house erupted. When American forces retook Sommocolonia days later, they found Fox's body in the rubble, and surrounding it, the bodies of approximately 100 German soldiers. His final adjustment had been perfectly executed. The forward observer had become the bullseye. The German assault that slammed into Sommocolonia at dawn was overwhelming. Veterans of the Austrian 4th Mountain Battalion, hardened and methodical, pushed into the village from multiple axes, supported by mortars and machine guns. Outnumbered and outgunned, the American riflemen and partisans fell back. Fox and his small observation party, a radioman and a handful of riflemen, did not retreat. They had volunteered for this Christmas mission, and they would see it through. From the second floor of a stone house, Fox had a commanding view of the main approaches. For hours, he had been the eyes of the 598th Field Artillery Battalion, calling in mission after mission, each adjustment tearing into the attacking formations. But now the enemy was at the door. The chatter of German small arms echoed through the narrow streets. Boots pounded on stone stairs. Fox raised the radio handset. His voice was steady, professional, as if he were still back at the Fire Direction Center, not surrounded by men who intended to kill him. He requested another adjustment, bringing the artillery even closer. His commander, his friend Otis Zachary, protested. The barrage was already at the edge of safety. Fox replied, "That was just where I wanted it. Bring it in 60 yards. The distance was cut in half. The shells fell closer. The house shuddered. Dust and debris rained down. Through the window, Fox could see the gray-green uniforms flooding the street below, pressing forward in numbers that made further resistance impossible. He had no illusions about his fate. He had already stayed far longer than duty required. Zachary's voice crackled through the receiver one final time. "Fox, that will be on you." Fox did not hesitate. His last transmission, preserved in the granite language of the Medal of Honor citation, was not a prayer or a plea. It was an order calm, absolute, and irrevocable. Asterisk. Fire it, there's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell. Asterisk. At approximately 0800 hours on December 26, 1944, the second floor of a stone house in Sommocolonia became the focal point of the entire Serchio Valley battle. First Lieutenant JohnRFox, crouched at a window with his radio handset, watched the gray-green uniforms of the German 4th Mountain Battalion flood the narrow streets below. He had already called in multiple fire missions, each adjustment tearing into the advancing formations. But now the enemy was at the door. Fox keyed the handset. At the Fire Direction Center of the 598th Field Artillery Battalion, miles behind the lines, his friend Lieutenant Otis Zachary heard the familiar voice come through the static. Fox gave his final adjustment. The next barrage would land directly on his coordinates. Zachary protested. The bombardment was already dangerously close. Fox replied, "That was just where I wanted it. Bring it in 60 yards. Zachary cut the distance in half. The shells fell closer. The stone house shuddered. Dust and debris rained down on Fox and his small observation party. Still, the Germans pressed forward, surrounding the position. Zachary's voice crackled through the receiver with one final, desperate warning. "Fox, that will be on you." There was no hesitation. Fox's last transmission, preserved in the granite language of the Medal of Honor citation, was not a prayer or a plea. It was an order, calm and absolute. Asterisk. Fire it, there's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell. Asterisk. At the Fire Direction Center, the radio operator stared at his handset. Zachary later recalled the moment. "I was crying. So was the entire battery. Everyone knew what we had done. We had killed our own man. He was asked 5 or 6 times. He just said, 'Put it on me.' The battery commander made the call. Guns elevated. Shells slammed into breeches. On the way. Time of flight, approximately 30 seconds. The first rounds impacted directly on Fox's coordinates. Then more. The stone house collapsed in a cloud of dust and fire. The German soldiers who had been massing for the final assault, confident, moments earlier, that victory was at hand, were suddenly engulfed in a wall of American steel. The shock was total and catastrophic. When the barrage lifted, the enemy attack on that sector had been broken. Days later, when American forces counterattacked and retook Sommocolonia, they found Fox's body in the rubble, still at his post. Around him lay the bodies of approximately 100 German soldiers, killed by the fire he had called upon himself. Fox's sacrifice was not in vain. His final mission delayed the enemy advance for critical hours, allowing the rest of the 92nd Infantry Division to reorganize, regroup, and prepare a counterattack that would drive the Germans back across the Serchio. The village was recaptured by January 1, 1945. Sommocolonia held. John Fox's commanders did not ignore his sacrifice. In the chaotic aftermath of the Serchio Valley battle, they wrote up the paperwork, recommending him for the nation's second highest award for valor. But somewhere in the vast, grinding bureaucracy of war, the recommendation was lost. The war ended. Fox's body was buried in Colebrook Cemetery, Whitman, Massachusetts. His widow, Arlene, raised their 2-year-old daughter, Sandra, alone, and the paperwork gathered dust in a forgotten file. 38 years later, in 1982, the lost recommendation was finally found and processed. President Ronald Reagan awarded John Fox the Distinguished Service Cross. Arlene Fox traveled to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, to accept it from her husband's old regiment. It was a moment of long-delayed justice, but it was not complete, because John Fox was not alone. Of the 433 Medals of Honor awarded for valor in World War II, not a single one had gone to an African-American soldier who served in the European or Mediterranean theaters. This was not a statistical anomaly. It was a reflection of systemic, institutional racism that permeated the Army's leadership and its awards process. In 1993, President Bill Clinton ordered the Pentagon to investigate. The Army commissioned Shaw University, a historically black college in North Carolina, to conduct a comprehensive study. 5 historians pored over thousands of records. Their 1995 report was unequivocal. A pattern of racial prejudice on the part of the white leadership of the 92nd Division pervaded the experience. The failure of African American soldiers to win a Medal of Honor definitely lay in the racial climate and practice within the Army in World War II. Congress waived the 52-year statute of limitations. 10 names were recommended. 7 were approved. On January 13, 1997, in the East Room of the White House, President Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to the family of First Lieutenant JohnRFox. His widow, Arlene, now 77 years old, accepted it. She had never remarried. "I think it sends a message to all, like a little wake-up call," she said, "that when a man does his duty, his color isn't important." John Fox's sacrifice did not end with the shell that killed him. It rippled outward through the Serchio Valley, through his regiment, through his family, and ultimately through the pages of American military history. Tactically, the impact was immediate and decisive. The official Medal of Honor citation states plainly, Fox's action inflicted heavy casualties, causing the deaths of approximately 100 German soldiers, thereby delaying the advance of the enemy until infantry and artillery units could be reorganized to meet the attack. Operation Wintergewitter, the German counteroffensive meant to rupture the Allied line, was blunted. As Italian historian Lieutenant Colonel Vittorio Lino Biondi later explained, Fox's sacrifice allowed the Americans to regroup in the valley below and fight again. Within the 92nd Infantry Division, Fox's story became legend. In a unit constantly forced to prove itself against the corrosive stereotype that black soldiers lacked courage, here was irrefutable evidence to the contrary. Here was a man who had not merely fought bravely, he had voluntarily called death upon himself to save his comrades and stop the enemy. Though the story was not widely publicized for decades, it passed quietly through the ranks of the Buffalo Soldiers, a source of pride and a silent rebuke to every officer who had ever doubted them. For his widow, Arlene E. Fox, the sacrifice was a lifetime of absence. She was 24 years old when her husband was killed, left to raise their 2-year-old daughter, Sandra, alone. She never remarried. For 38 years, she carried the knowledge of what John had done, with only a lost recommendation and a fading memory to sustain her. When the Distinguished Service Cross was finally awarded in 1982, she accepted it with quiet dignity. When the Medal of Honor ceremony was announced in 1997, she spoke not of bitterness, but of truth. "I think it sends a message to all, like a wake-up call, that when a man does his duty, his color isn't important." And finally, the broader reckoning. Fox was one of 7 men honored that January day in 1997. Their stories, unearthed by the Shaw University study, forced America to confront a half-century of systemic prejudice in its highest awards for valor. President Clinton was unequivocal. No African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for his service in World War II received it. Today, we fill the gap in that picture. John Fox's sacrifice places him in an honored lineage of warriors who have made the ultimate call, voluntarily directing fire upon their own position to annihilate the enemy. From the frozen hills of the Chosin Reservoir to the mountains of Afghanistan, this rarest of combat acts has defined the Medal of Honor's highest standard. Fox was a pioneer of that sacrifice, and his name now stands alongside those who gave the same order. Fire it on me. Within the narrative of African American military service, Fox is a central, luminous figure. He stands with the Tuskegee Airmen, who proved black men could master the most complex machinery of war. He stands with the 761st Tank Battalion, who punched through the Siegfried Line. But Fox's sacrifice is uniquely personal, uniquely absolute. He did not merely fight well. He deliberately, calmly chose death to purchase his comrades' survival. As historian Simon Went notes, black military heroism became both an opportunity for African Americans to claim full membership in the American nation, and a powerful rebuttal to the racist assumptions codified in the 1925 Army War College document that declared black soldiers mentally inferior and unable to control themselves in danger. Fox demolished that lie with 8 words spoken into a radio handset. In the hills above Sommocolonia, his sacrifice was never forgotten. The villagers erected a monument to 9 men killed in that artillery barrage, 8 Italian soldiers and Lieutenant JohnRFox. In July 2000, they dedicated a peace park in his memory. Across the ocean, American Legion Post 631 in Cincinnati, Ohio, bears his name. For the men of that post, Fox was never a forgotten footnote. As George Allen, a World War II veteran, put it. White society may not have known about John Fox, but we always knew. He's been our hero for 50 years. He's a hero just like Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson. The 1997 White House ceremony was more than a medal presentation. It was a national reckoning. President Clinton acknowledged what the Shaw University study had proven, that systemic racism had denied black soldiers their due for half a century. No African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for his service in World War II received it, Clinton said. Today, we fill the gap in that picture. It did not undo the injustice. It did not bring John Fox back to his widow or his daughter. But it placed his name, finally, in the pantheon of American valor. The system was flawed. The men were not. So what is the ultimate, haunting lesson from this story of a radio, an unshakable will, and 100 German dead? The ultimate lesson of John Fox's sacrifice is this. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of something greater that overcomes it. John Fox was afraid. Every soldier is. The shrapnel tearing through his room, the gray flood of enemy uniforms in the streets below, the certain knowledge that the next shell would be his last. These were not abstractions. They were terror made manifest. But his duty to his men, his mission, and his country was greater than his fear of death. He traded his life for theirs, and for the defeat of the enemy. This story is not just about John Fox. It is about every soldier who has ever faced the final moment and chosen to fight, not flee. It is about the debt we owe to those who make that choice, a debt that cannot be repaid, only remembered. For 52 years, that debt lay unacknowledged. The paperwork was lost. The witnesses grew old. The nation moved on. But the memory did not die. It was kept alive by a widow who never remarried, by veterans who never forgot their comrade, and by a small Italian village that erected a monument to the 9 men who died in that stone house. On January 13, 1997, in the East Room of the White House, President Bill Clinton spoke the words that should have been spoken in 1944. Second Lieutenant John R. Fox gave his life that day so that his fellow soldiers might live. In doing so, he wrote a chapter in the history of American courage that can never be forgotten. Today, we finally give him the thanks of a grateful nation. This story is inscribed in Medal of Honor citations and the hearts of a family who waited 52 years for justice. If you want to discover more incredible true stories of unsung heroes and the long fight for their recognition, subscribe. We remember those who should never be forgotten. Next time, we'll tell another story of extraordinary sacrifice, the chaplain who gave up his life jacket. How 4 chaplains of different faiths went down with the USS Dorchester, giving their life vests to young soldiers, is a story of faith and brotherhood that transcends war itself. History's final judgment is not always swift. For John Fox, it took 52 years. But it came. And in that long-delayed moment, a grateful nation finally said what should have been said in 1944. Thank you. We remember. We will not forget.